The man had lost everything, but the terrifying realization was not the loss of his money or his name. It was the discovery that the smooth, expensive skin of his life was merely a costume, and he had no idea who was supposed to be wearing it. Julian Thorne had always measured success by subtraction, by the things he successfully eliminated: wasted time, unnecessary emotion, unprofitable ventures. His life was a study in controlled sterility.
Every morning, the single silver spoon he used for his single cup of black coffee was positioned precisely 3 millimeters from the edge of the granite countertop.
His schedule was fixed to the minute, guarded by 2 layers of executive assistants who understood that a delay of 30 seconds was a violation of the firm's core mandate: efficiency above all.
Thorne Capital managed assets that dwarfed the GDP of small nations. Julian controlled the flow of capital, and through that, he controlled consequences. He did not build things, he acquired them, optimized them, and then liquidated the parts that did not serve the new function.
He was a force of nature, dressed in custom-tailored Italian wool, and the entire city of Manhattan operated on his frequency. He had learned early that true power resided in silence. He never raised his voice. He never celebrated. He simply waited, knowing that the market or the person across the table would eventually collapse under the weight of its own flawed complexity. His personal life mirrored this precision. No wife, no children, only a penthouse overlooking Central Park that felt more like a climate-controlled data center than a home. Then came the accident. Not a catastrophic, cinematic explosion, but a cold, precise intrusion. A late-night car service, a sudden patch of black ice on the bridge returning from a late meeting in Connecticut, and the brief, visceral lurch sideways. The last thing Julian remembered was the faint, metallic scent of ozone before the world went white, then utterly black. He woke up to the muted beige of a public hospital room. The light was harsh, unfiltered fluorescent, the antithesis of the recessed, calibrated lighting in his penthouse. A nurse was checking his vitals, her movements weary and mechanical. He tried to speak, but only a thick, dry rasp emerged. He felt a throbbing pressure behind his eyes, a sensation of static where his thoughts should have been.
Mr. John Doe, the doctor said later, reading from a chart. We've run the tox screen and CT scans. You took a heavy hit to the frontal lobe. Physically, you're recovering. He paused, his gaze professionally sympathetic.
We haven't been able to locate any ID, and you haven't been able to provide us with a name, date of birth, or any personal details. You have a case of severe, total retrograde.
Julian, the man who no longer knew he was Julian, stared at the doctor. The words held no meaning, yet they generated a deep internal panic. Not the panic of fear, but the panic of a high-functioning machine suddenly discovering its central operating system was blank. He felt the expensive fabric of the suit jacket they had carefully preserved hanging over the chair, but the feel of the wool against his fingers provided no connection, no resonance. It was just fabric. The hospital eventually had to release him.
After 3 weeks and no successful identification through fingerprints or missing persons reports, because Julian Thorne was considered too important to simply go missing, his team handled these things discreetly and assumed he was out of communication on private business. He was given a generic discharge packet and directions to a shelter.
He was a ghost in the city he owned. He walked out onto the street, and the noise of New York assaulted him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, naked, despite the expensive suit. The suit was the final cruelty, a heavy, ill-fitting marker of a life he couldn't access. He gravitated toward the East River, drawn by the cold, metallic smell of the water. He didn't know how to navigate the subway, how to buy food, or where he was supposed to sleep. He was an infant with the reflexes of a predator.
He sat on a bench in a small, forgotten park, watching the city lights blur. He spent the first night huddled under the bench, the cold seeping through the expensive wool.
It was 2 days later, near the emergency entrance of the hospital where he had been discharged, that he encountered Clara.
Clara Mendoza was finishing her third consecutive 12-hour shift. She moved with the exhausted efficiency of someone perpetually juggling 2 minimum-wage jobs and a community college schedule. She saw him immediately. He wasn't like the other homeless men. He was clean, his hair was still neatly cut, but his posture was wrong, too rigid, too confused. He was staring at his own hands as if they were alien artifacts.
She approached him not out of pity, but out of professional concern. She recognized the vacant look in his eyes. She had seen Amnesia before.
"Are you okay?" she asked, pulling out a half-eaten granola bar. He looked up. His eyes, though weary, were sharp, a piercing shade of blue-gray. He didn't speak the usual jargon of the street. He simply stated a fact. "I don't know who I—"
"I know," she said quietly. "They discharged you. You were John Doe." He accepted the granola bar, tearing the wrapper with hesitant movements. This small act of kindness, purely transactional, involving a bar that cost less than $1, felt like the most significant exchange he had experienced in weeks. "I need to work," he stated, the old commanding instinct surfacing despite the blank slate. "I don't have." Clara managed a weary smile. "Nobody starts with currency out here, not unless you're selling newspapers from—" She looked at his suit. "You can't stay in that. You'll be—" She found herself, against all financial logic, taking him in. She gave him the spare keys to her tiny, fifth-floor walk-up apartment in Queens, a cramped space dominated by the faint smell of antiseptic and burnt toast. She arbitrarily decided to call him Leo, after the lion figurine she kept on her windowsill. "Leo," she repeated, testing the sound. "It's solid. You need a—"
And so Julian Thorne became Leo. The next few months were an education in reality for Leo.
He learned that water was not always filtered, that time was dictated not by a carefully calibrated clock, but by the next rent payment, and that the greatest scarcity was not capital, but simple rest. Clara was his accidental guide. She taught him how to ride the bus, how to find cheap meals, and how to ignore the constant low thrum of anxiety that accompanied poverty.
Leo, retaining the relentless focus of his former self, applied the same rigid attention to these new tasks. He learned to patch drywall, fix leaky faucets, and organize the chaotic world of Clara's tiny apartment. His hands, which had only ever signed billion-dollar contracts, now became skilled at physical labor.
He discovered that he loved the visceral satisfaction of building, fixing, making things tangibly better. He took small, odd jobs, moving furniture, cleaning warehouses, jobs that required brute force and concentration. He was quiet, always observant.
Clara often worked double shifts, leaving Leo alone. They settled into a quiet, almost domestic rhythm. She never pushed him about his past.
She saw the pain in his eyes when he tried to recall something and failed, and she offered him simple comfort, the texture of clean sheets, the warmth of shared coffee.
"It doesn't matter who you were," she told him one night, leaning against the kitchen counter, exhausted. "You're Leo now. You're quiet, and you fix my stove, and you remember to buy the cheap coffee I like. That's—" Leo began to feel a sensation he had never registered before. Connection. Not networking, not synergy, but the profound, quiet interdependence of two people navigating a difficult reality together.
He realized Julian Thorne never needed anyone. Leo needed Clara. They shared small moments of confession in the late hours. Clara had grown up in rural Pennsylvania. Her family had owned a reputable, mid-sized construction company for 3 generations.
It wasn't a fortune, but it was honest, stable wealth, built brick by brick. "We lost it all about 10 years ago," Clara recounted, stirring her lukewarm tea. Her voice was flat, devoid of melodrama, which made the story heavier. A large private equity firm came in.
They didn't even want the company. They wanted the land and the contracts, and they wanted to crush the competition, which was us. They offered pennies on the dollar to my father, who refused, believing in the value of his. She stopped, gathering her memory. They didn't negotiate. They just squeezed. They bought up the debt, filed endless frivolous lawsuits, delayed payments on completed contracts.
My dad fought them for 3 years, trying to save the jobs of his employees. It broke him. He had a massive heart attack the week they forced the final liquidation. My mother had to move in with her.
Clara stared into her tea, the old grief surfacing like sediment. They were just numbers on a spreadsheet to those people, just collateral damage. That's why I left home. I needed a job that actually involved helping people, not destroying.
Leo listened, his face impassive. The story chilled him in a way he couldn't explain. The ruthless, calculated malice Clara described felt profoundly wrong, yet disturbingly familiar.
He registered the coldness of the act, the efficiency of the destruction.
Weeks later, a shift occurred. Leo had managed to save enough money to buy an old, refurbished laptop. He used it mostly to look up technical specs for repair jobs. One rainy afternoon, searching for obscure zoning laws for a client, an old headline accidentally surfaced in his search history.
Thorn Capital acquires assets of Pennsylvania's Mendoza Construction in hostile liquidation.
The name hit him like a physical blow. He stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Then his eyes dropped to the small 3-word credit buried beneath the headline: Julian Thorn.
The silence in the small apartment became crushing. The external world faded. Leo was suddenly flooded with a dizzying cascade of images, data, and cold, crystalline understanding.
The memories didn't drift back gently. They slammed into him, an overwhelming download of years of high-stakes corporate warfare, proprietary data, and the precise, sterile memory of signing the liquidation order for Mendoza Construction.
Julian Thorn was back.
He sat motionless for nearly an hour, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the cheap plastic desk. The weight of his old identity, the billions, the responsibility, the ruthlessness, settled on him like a shroud of concrete.
The man who ruined Clara's life, who inadvertently caused her father's death, was the same man she had rescued from the street and given a name. The internal collapse was silent and absolute. Julian felt the stark, terrifying dichotomy between the two men. Julian Thorn operated purely on leverage and outcome. Leo operated on kindness and immediate need.
Julian Thorn saw people as variables. Leo saw Clara.
He remembered the spreadsheet. He remembered the brief presentation from his acquisition team. Mendoza is small, but strategically positioned, must be neutralized quickly to ensure market dominance in the Northeast. There had been no malice, just pure mathematical necessity. He hadn't even looked at the names involved. They were just entries. Now he knew the name: Clara.
He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his original life pressing down on him. He could call his private security team right now.
Within 2 hours, he could be clean, debriefed, back in his tailored suit, his assets unfrozen, and this entire bizarre episode erased, a footnote in his security file.
But he looked around the small, warm apartment. He saw the chipped mug Clara used, the small pile of books she loved, the worn spot on the sofa where they watched bad television.
He saw the life he had built from nothing but pure, unvarnished human interaction.
He considered the options.
Option 1. He could tell her everything. Clara, I am Julian Thorn. I am the man who destroyed your family. I am... The consequence was immediate, unavoidable devastation. He would lose her instantly.
He would destroy the fragile, beautiful reality they had created. Option 2. He could leave, vanish back into the shadows of Thorn Capital, and resume his old life, burying the Leo persona deep beneath layers of concrete and capital.
The consequence was a lifetime of suffocating emptiness, knowing he had sacrificed the only genuine connection he had ever known for the sake of sterile control.
He could retain the memories of Julian Thorn, but choose to remain Leo.
He understood the profound moral weight of option 3. It was a lie of existence.
It was a denial of his history, a constant, high-stakes psychological tightrope walk.
Yet, it was the only option that preserved the fragile humanity he had discovered. Julian realized with brutal clarity that the man Clara loved, Leo, was not Julian Thorne. Leo was a consequence of the amnesia, a better, quieter man, born from the void. If he revealed his true identity, Leo would cease to exist, and Clara would be left with the enemy.
The choice was not about regaining his power. It was about defining his nature. He had spent 40 years believing that power meant control over the external world.
He now realized that the ultimate act of power was the disciplined control over his own narrative, the decision to choose who he was, regardless of who he had been. That evening, when Clara returned, exhausted from her shift, Leo was calmly making dinner, a simple rice and bean dish she loved.
"Rough?" he asked, stirring the pot.
"The usual," she sighed, dropping her keys on the counter. "I think I'm going to drop the evening class. I just can't keep up the—"
"You should," Leo agreed simply. "Burnout doesn't calculate." He used the word calculate without thinking, a residual echo from the Julian Thorne database. Clara didn't notice. Julian Thorne began the rigorous, disciplined process of self-erasure.
He accessed old emails and internal documents using a hidden VPN, confirming the scope of the Mendoza destruction. He knew the precise numbers, the legal maneuvers.
He felt a chilling detachment when viewing the data, recognizing the efficient brilliance of the hostile takeover, followed immediately by the deep physical revulsion of Leo.
He systematically destroyed every remaining trace of the life he could reclaim. He found the expensive watch the hospital had bagged and returned to him, a platinum Vacheron Constantine.
He walked to the river, the watch cool and heavy in his palm, and tossed it into the murky water. The splash was tiny, insignificant. He did the same with the suit jacket, cutting it into unrecognizable scraps and discarding them in different dumpsters across the city. He needed to be physically incapable of retreating. The risk of one day stumbling upon a memory trigger in the old life was too great. He began to use the vast encyclopedic knowledge of Julian Thorne for small, immediate acts of goodness. He knew real estate values intimately. He used this knowledge to help Clara find a better, slightly cheaper apartment lease. He knew how to navigate bureaucratic systems, using his memory of complex legal structures to challenge an unjust medical bill Clara had received. Julian Thorne was the ghost in the machine, running the system for the benefit of Leo and Clara. The tension was the silence. Julian had to filter every word, every gesture, ensuring that the cold, precise language of finance never slipped into the warm, practical dialect of Leo. He had to fake the continued confusion about his past, maintaining the facade of a quiet man who remembered nothing of the world before Clara. One day, Clara found an old, expensive leather wallet tucked into the lining of the old suit jacket before she cut it up. Inside, there were a few crumpled notes, but no ID. "Leo," she said, holding the wallet out, "this is quality leather. You must have been someone—" Julian looked at the wallet. It was a bespoke item, a quiet symbol of seven-figure wealth. He saw the cold gleam of the engraved initials, barely visible. He took the wallet, turned it over in his hands, and shrugged slowly, deliberately. "If I was," he said, injecting the correct tone of confused sorrow, "he's gone, and I don't think I like the feel of." He handed the wallet back to her. "Put flowers in it, Clara. It makes a better vase than a—" She laughed, a genuine, tired sound that echoed through the small room. That sound was worth more than his entire portfolio. Years passed. Leo and Clara established a life. He worked as a general contractor's assistant, a physically demanding, honest job. He had calluses on his hands, the kind Julian Thorne had only seen on the men who worked the elevators in his buildings. They married in a small ceremony at the municipal courthouse. There were no grand pronouncements, no extravagant gestures, just the quiet, mutual commitment of two people who had found safety in each other.
Julian, operating as Leo,
had achieved a kind of peace that his old life, despite its vast power, had never offered. He was free from the tyranny of consequence, except for the one major crushing consequence he carried internally, the truth.
He sometimes caught his reflection in the glass of the subway car, a man in his late 40s, lines around his eyes, looking content. He saw the ghost of Julian Thorne, the sharp, hungry ambition, but it was muted, overlaid with the gentle weariness of honest labor.
He never forgot the liquidation of Mendoza Construction. He never forgot the face of Clara's father from the archived news photos.
The memory was the price of his new life, the silent penance he paid every morning when he woke up beside the woman he loved.
One chilly evening, they were sitting on their small balcony overlooking the street. The sounds of Queens were a low, comforting hum. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I wonder," she whispered, "about your past. If you ever remember something, would you tell?"
Julian tightened his arm around her. This was the precipice, the moment he had rehearsed silently 1,000 times. He looked out at the lights of the city, at the distant, glittering geometry of Manhattan, the empire he had built and abandoned. He saw the shadow of Thorne Capital high above the river.
"I remember enough," he said, his voice calm, steady, and utterly truthful, yet completely misleading. "I remember waking up and seeing you, and I remember every single day."
He paused, letting the silence hold the weight of the moment.
"I don't think," Leo finished, "that the man before me was very happy. I don't think he knew how to be simple. If he came back, Clara, I think he would just ruin." She squeezed his hand, misunderstanding completely, but receiving the exact emotional reassurance he intended.
"Well," she murmured, "I'm glad you stayed lost, Leo. Whoever he was a—"
Julian Thorne closed his eyes, accepting the finality of the choice. He had liquidated the ultimate asset, himself. He had traded billions for connection, control for vulnerability, and ambition for peace. It was the most profitable transaction he had ever executed. The only wealth that mattered was the one he shared on this small balcony, under the anonymous, indifferent gaze of the city. He would remain Leo, the man who remembered nothing, because remembering everything would cost him the only life worth living.
If you thought the choice between honesty and happiness was the hardest decision Julian Thorne ever faced, wait until you discover the coded message he left buried deep within Thorne Capital servers, a message that only Clara's long-lost brother is capable of finding, a message that reveals the true, staggering extent of Julian's penance.
And the secret transaction that could expose their entire manufactured life.
Click the link below to find out what happens when the past begins to pay its debts.